Good morning. Today, I would say we have a fascinating story out of Genesis 24. It's a story about marriage, and not only is it different than most North American cultures of that, but we don't see in any of the rest of the biblical text so much detail about the marriage ceremony and about the marriage process. Now, most of you would know that my daughter Adrienne owns a bridal boutique called Marry Me in Albany, and that Adrienne and my wife Deborah work there helping brides to look beautiful, selling them wedding dresses and veils and everything else to help a marriage ceremony go very well. And over the last 27 years, I've also officiated at numerous weddings, and so the wedding ceremonies and getting ready for wedding ceremonies, our family is closely connected to that. Now, marriage is very common in virtually every culture in the world, but not all traditions are exactly the same. In fact, there are some that are drastically different than other ones. Originally, I was going to read the entire text out of Genesis 24 for you, but in the interest of being a little shorter, I would encourage you to read it for yourself. And I encourage you to read the whole chapter at one time. Chapter 24 is all about getting a wife for Isaac. And with all the details in there, we know that the marriage ceremony, or telling us the story of the marriage ceremony, was very important to the biblical writers. Now, wedding ceremonies have changed a lot in the last 100 years. And in both my mother's family and my father's family, I have double first cousins. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, it simply means that two siblings from one family marry two siblings from a different family. So in my mother's family of 8 from Iowa, my mother's only 2 sisters married 2 Beckler boys from right here in Lebanon, Oregon. And then 2 of the younger brothers actually married 2 sisters from Indiana. And in my father's family, 2 of his older brothers married 2 Esch sisters from down the Harrisburg area. And 2 of his sisters also married 2 Reimer boys from Kansas. And during my parents' generation, people didn't travel or get around as much as they do in our current generation, or even my generation. And so a lot of times people would meet potential spouses at other events. And I know in all 4 cases that I noted in my mother's and father's family, the younger siblings met their spouse at the older siblings' weddings. Now, I have over 100 first cousins because the families are very large. But I only know of one instance of where 2 of my sisters of my family married 2 brothers from Idaho. But other than that, it was more in my parents' generation than it is in my generations. Weddings have changed a lot in the last 100 years, and yet for all the weddings that I'm aware of in my family, the spouses got to choose the other spouse. In other words, even my grandparents chose their spouse, unlike where a lot of places in the world, they were arranged marriage. In my family, the people chose their spouse. Weddings have changed a lot, but I know that we think that marriages or arranged marriages are very different from how we do in this culture, and yet they are very common in some areas of the world. If you go to Northern Africa or Southern Asia, they would say, stats say that there are 50 to 60% of the weddings that take place there are arranged marriages. In this Genesis 24 story, as it goes on, after Sarah, Abraham's wife, dies, Father Abraham, who is at age 137, is looking for a wife for his son Isaac. And as the story goes, Isaac doesn't have a lot to do with chapter 24. In fact, isn't even mentioned until the very end of the chapter, but he has to be the willing groom. This is a very grand story, and I think in some respects almost like a fairy tale. I know that as the story begins, Father Abraham is at 137, probably maybe too old to go looking for a wife for Isaac. And so he sends out his servant, who we think is Eliezer, because it says in the previous chapter, in chapter 15 of Genesis, that's who Abraham's servant was. But we know from a part of this story, we get a snapshot into what marriage was like in their culture. And every part of this story tells us how different it was from how we do the marriage ceremonies today. Typically in our culture, people are more active socially and looking forward to traits or parts of that they would seek in a mate, or in many instances now, people go on websites on the internet like Match.com or something like that to search for a mate. But in this model, the story out of Genesis 24, it's a very different way to look for a spouse. Genesis 24 starts out with Abraham empowering or commissioning his servant to do the very exact work of getting a perfect wife for his son. Again, the text doesn't tell us, but most people think, most biblical scholars think it was Eliezer of Damascus. One facet that I think is pretty interesting in this story is that, again, the groom isn't mentioned much at all. It talks about the groom's parents, it talks about Rebecca, the bride-to-be, and it talks about Rebecca's family. But anyway, so Abraham sends out his servant to look for a wife among his extended family. And so he loads up 10 camels with all kinds of gifts. So just a little side note here to give you a perspective. This is a huge amount of gifts. National Geographic says that a camel can carry between 400 and 600 pounds. So if he loads up 10 camels, Abraham's servant is taking somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of gifts to encourage this bride to come back and be a part of Abraham's family. So he literally has 2 or 3 tons of gifts that he's taken on this bridal search. And when the servant gets to the city of Nahor, he has the camels kneel down near the well where all the young ladies would come to get their water that day. And as he's waiting there, he prays this prayer to God. I'm going to stand out here by the well when the young women from the town come to get their water, and I'm going to ask the young woman for a drink. And if she says, yeah, I have a drink for you, and I'll get water for your camels too, then I'll know it's a definite sign for you that this is the wife for Isaac. And as he is literally praying that prayer, Rebecca shows up at the well and he asks her for a drink. And she says, yes, I have a drink for you and I'll get water for your camels too. And since camels can drink a lot of water, Rebecca has a lot of work to do. She is getting this water by hand. She doesn't just walk over and flip the switch for the electric pump to bring up more water. She has to bring up the water herself. And most camels can drink 20 gallons of water at one time. And so Rebecca is literally getting an extra 200 gallons of water up out of this well. And then when she is done watering the camels, the servant of Abraham pulls out gifts for her. Pulls out 2 gold bracelets and a gold nose ring, which together would have weighed about 1/4 of a pound. So in today's value, it would have been about $8,000 worth of gold. And he gives them to Rebecca. Rebecca goes and shows the gold to her family, and Laban, who is Rebecca's brother, comes back to the servant and talks with him and invites him to come stay at their house that evening. And then the servant goes, and again, it repeats all the same story of how he got there and his prayer to God and how Rebecca answered the prayer. And after they hear this story, Both Laban, her brother, and Bethuel, her father, said, "This must be from God. Go ahead and take her." And so then the servant gave more gold and silver jewelry to Rebekah's family and expensive clothes, and then said, "Well, let's go." And they said, "Well, wait a minute here. Let's wait about 10 days so that Rebekah has time to make preparations and say goodbye to her family." But Abraham's servant says, "No, we need to leave immediately." And so they asked Rebekah, "Well, what do you think?" And Rebekah says, "I'm good to go." And so they left immediately after they gave her a blessing. They sent her and they sent her nurse with her. And so they went on their way back to Abraham and Isaac. And the text tells us that when they were getting close, Rebekah covered herself, and then they got married in Sarah's, or Isaac's mother's, tent, and they fell in love, and Rebekah helped Isaac get through the grief period that he was suffering because of his mother dying. When I first read this story again, and I've read this story many times over the previous time, but I read the story and I had to think, well, who lets some kind of a total stranger put a ring in your nose? And yet, if you read it carefully, it doesn't say that the servant of Abraham pierced Rebekah's nose. It simply says he gave her 2 bracelets and a nose ring. I would also say another aspect of this story from in today's culture, we think this would be some kind of a biological disaster. In other words, if you would marry somebody from your own family, down the line there would be genetic problems and you would have all kinds of chaos. But in their culture, it was perfectly acceptable. And one of the key elements of this story is Abraham's desire for Isaac not to marry a foreign girl, not to marry one of the local girls from that land. Because in the past, some Israelite men had married local girls and it presented all kinds of problems. If Isaac had a foreign wife, there would be a good chance or an added danger that this foreign wife would teach any of their children to worship her God, in other words, God, small g, rather than worshiping Yahweh or God, capital G. And there also would be the problem that she may not teach them Hebrew. She may teach them her own language rather than teaching Hebrew, which is, again, the problem that we see in Nehemiah 13. So according to Isaac, his father's servant had found the perfect wife for him. And yet we know that as we read the biblical story, Rebekah wasn't perfect because Rebekah also helped her son Jacob deceive Isaac into giving the birthright to Jacob instead of the oldest son, Esau. And so we come to the part of the message of where we have to ask ourselves, well, what can we learn from this story about searching for the perfect wife for Isaac, or this story looking at the cultural aspects of marriage from their culture? What can we learn from this story now, hundreds and hundreds of years later, when we are attempting to follow God faithfully and yet having to deal with the coronavirus in 2020? I think there are 2 key points that we can learn from this text. The first one is to acknowledge the divine providence of God. Everything in this story hinges on the fact that God gave specific divine sign. The servant made a simple request in the prayer. He prays to God, "I'm going to stand by the well when the young women from town come to get their water, and I'm going to ask a young woman for a drink. And if she says, 'Yeah, I have a drink for you, and I'll get water for your camels too,' then I'll know this is a direct sign from you and that this is the lady for Isaac." See, without God's interaction, i.e. the divine sign that Rebekah is the lady, there is no story here. This story doesn't happen. Without God's direction, Rebekah and Isaac never ever get together, and this love story dies on the vine. The second point is that This story shows the willingness of people to be used by God. For Rebekah, it is a step into the unknown. She is supposed to get to somebody she's never ever met, get married to somebody she's never ever met before and never ever seen. Now we know from the part of the story where the 10 camels are coming, she's not going into a life of poverty, but it still is a huge step based on the words of a total stranger. But Rebekah is willing to step into the role that God called her to. And when she does that, she very literally becomes the mother of Israel. The other willing servant in this story is the head servant of Abraham, again, who the Bible scholars think is Eliezer of Damascus. He goes on a mission for his master, heads into a foreign land looking for the perfect wife for Abraham's son Isaac. The text does not really tell us, but again, Abraham at age 137 probably isn't physically up for doing this task himself, as we know from the other text a couple weeks ago, where Hagar went and got a wife for her son Ishmael from Egypt. Abraham probably can't do that on his own now. And so he sends his head servant. And the part about this story is kind of amazing is that even though there's all kinds of detail in this story, and the servant does a spectacular job of finding the wife for Isaac, he isn't even mentioned at all. We don't ever even know what his name is. His name isn't even mentioned in the story. And I think it takes a very mature person, a person who's very confident of who they are and confident in their role of working, to not even to try to seek some acknowledgement of the work or the great job that he did. This morning, I would say that God is still very much involved in the lives of people. Divine providence is very much a thing that happens now. God is still looking for willing servants to work in his kingdom. So on this holiday weekend, I encourage you to be in tune with the Holy Spirit, to be aware of what God is working at in and around in our community. And when God calls you to serve, I encourage you to be a very willing servant in the same way that Rebekah was willing and that Abraham's servant was willing. I would also be the first to acknowledge that most of the roles God calls us to have a lot more to do with a role like Abraham's servant, where we aren't going to get a lot of public acknowledgement. We aren't going to get a lot of slaps on the backs or attaboys or attagirls or whatever. A lot of them are going to be very roles behind the scene. But that role, just like Rebekah's role, is essential to God's kingdom being built and to us faithfully following God. May God continue to richly bless each one of you.